Okay, Ezra 5 and 6. Let's read about the historical. We just read Haggai and Zechariah, so we read the prophetic look at this period of time. Now let's read about the historical look at this period of time. What actually happened in terms of the facts of the events of this period of time. Now, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them, helping them. At that time, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, the region beyond the river, west of the Euphrates River, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates went to them and asked, "Who authorized you to rebuild this temple and restore this structure?" Tattenai clearly was under the impression that they were not supposed to do this. And they hadn't done for 15 years. They also asked, what are the names of the men constructing this building? There's a footnote down here saying some alternate versions have it, we told them the names of the men constructing this building. But the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped until a report could go to Darius, and his written reply be received. So Tattenai did not stop them from rebuilding the temple, or did not stop their work on it. He wanted to know who authorized it, but he didn't stop them. He sent a letter to the king instead for information or instruction on what to do. This is a copy of the letter that Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates, the officials of Trans-Euphrates, the region beyond the river, sent to King Darius. The report they sent him read as follows. I have another cat out here, so I have to move this. There's another cat out here bothering me. To King Darius, cordial greetings. The king should know that we went to the district of Judah, to the temple of the great God. The people are building it with large stones and placing the timbers in the walls. The work is being carried on with diligence and is making rapid progress in the direction. They finished the whole thing in about 4 years, which is pretty impressive for that day and time and with a building as big as this. We questioned the elders and asked them, who authorized you to rebuild this temple and restore this structure? We also asked them their names so that we could write down the names of their leaders for your information. So these are the guys you got to go after. If they're breaking the law, then here's Zerubbabel, Joshua, Zechariah, and Haggai. These are the 4 guys you got to get if there's trouble. This is the answer they gave us. So this is them quoting the Jews in this letter to their king. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, one that a great king of Israel built and finished. That'd be Solomon, of course. They wouldn't necessarily know that, but the Jews would. But because our fathers angered the God of heaven, he handed them over to Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean, king of Babylon, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, and that had been about 20 years ago by now. Okay, Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC and issued his decree around the same time, maybe a year after. This is now 520 BC, so this has been 19 years ago by now. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. He even removed from the temple of Babylon the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to the temple in Babylon. Then King Cyrus gave them a man named Sheshbazzar, whom he had appointed governor, and told him, take these articles and go and deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem, and rebuild the house of God on its site. So this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem. We read about that earlier. That had been like 18 years ago, or 16 years ago maybe. From that day to the present, it has been under construction, but it is not yet. That's a stretching of the truth. Actually, it wasn't under construction for most of that time. They let the project go idle for about 15 of those 16 years, So that is a stretching of the truth. It was not under construction the whole time. But they're trying to make their work seem legitimate in the eyes of the king. So they're saying, King Cyrus told us we could do this, and we've been doing it ever since. It's just not finished yet. But we know from Haggai and Zechariah that they actually did stop. And they fought to some degree voluntarily. Now, some of it was due to their own discouragement. Read about that in Ezra and Haggai. Some of the older men were discouraged. They may have discouraged some of the younger men. Some of that was due to the opposition they faced of their people around them who got in their ways and politically thwarted them. That seems to have been where Tatnai was coming. I don't know if Tatnai himself tried to thwart them. He doesn't seem to have. But he apparently was under the impression that they weren't supposed to build this temple. They didn't stop them from doing it. But he had apparently been under the impression they weren't supposed to. And that would have come from the political opposition of the people around them. But in the end, they stopped because they decided to stop. And then they got focused on their own houses, as God talks about in Haggai. So it hasn't been under construction from that day to this. There was a long period of time in which they weren't doing anything with it. And they had more to do with themselves than to do with their circumstances, the people around them. But they're stretching the truth just a bit here. If they acknowledged they had stopped working on it for 15 years, that would make it seem less legitimate in the eyes of the officials. So they don't really mention that. Now, if it pleases the king, this is Tatnai's words, apparently, back to in the letter, let a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did, in fact, issue a decree to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem. Then let the king send us his decision in this matter. King Darius, so he receives the letter, okay? It takes a few months for the letter to get there, and he receives it. He issued an order, and they searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. The scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana, not in Babylon itself for some reason, but in Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written, right now as I speak here in January 16, 2023, one of the big stories of our day is classified documents. What leaders and presidents and vice presidents do with classified documents when they leave office. That's basically what's going on here too. They're looking for a classified document left behind by Cyrus. Whatever the reason, it wasn't in Babylon where they expected it to be, but they did find it in Ecbatana, one of their other capitals. The scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it. Memorandum. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 90 feet high and 90 feet wide. That's actually probably a scribal error. That was not the dimensions of the original temple. With 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers. The cost is to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple in Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. Now then, Tatnai, governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai, and you, their fellow officials of the province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work of the temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. I don't want her to get into that. Moreover, I hereby decree what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. The expenses of these men are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury, from the revenues of the region beyond the river, so that the work will not stop. So Tatnai is going to have to empty his own coffers to fund the building of this temple. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs, or burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven, and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. So it wasn't just out of the goodness of his heart he's doing this, and it's not because he necessarily cares that much or wants, to follow the Jews' God. But if they're doing this to honor their God, that he wants them to pray for him, to their God, for him and his sons. That's what he wants to get out of this. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled from his house, so one of the foundation beams of his own house, or timber beams of his own house, and he is to be lifted up and impaled on it. That's one of the things they did back to the people in those days. They planted, I guess, essentially what crucifixion is. Okay, I don't know if this is referring to crucifixion or just sticking a guy on a stick, but it's kind of the same thing. And for this crime, his house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy this temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. So, that solves the problem of the political opposition now, doesn't it? Then, because of the decree, kings... Now, this whole message would have taken at least a year to get back. It was at least a 5-month journey under normal conditions to make it one way there, then one way back, and having to look for these records, and having to go to Ecbatana to look for the records. I mean, this would have been at least a year from the time Tatnai sent his request out to the time their answer was given and brought back. And they were working on the temple that whole time. Then, because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, region beyond the river, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. They were not hostile to the Jews. Their predecessors may have been, but these guys weren't, apparently. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished, the Haggai, from what we've got in his book, only prophesied for a few months. But this whole process would have taken at least more than a year to finish. So was he there the whole time? Maybe, I guess, apparently, who knows. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. Now, Artaxerxes is going to be a king like 60 years from now, okay? He is not going to have a hand in the building of the temple itself. He will be Nehemiah's king when we get down to Nehemiah. This is just one of those things where the ancient writers, didn't think of chronology and time the way that we do. Okay, whoever edited this book into its final form and put these first 6 chapters, Ezra himself hasn't even shown up in the story yet. This is the book of Ezra, and Ezra only comes in near the end, Ezra 7. He's not even here yet. Okay, and Nehemiah will be here after Ezra. And Artaxerxes is the king in Nehemiah's day. Okay. To the ancient mind, this is fine. Okay, accrediting Artaxerxes with the achievements of his kings 60 years before him, it makes sense to them. It may not make sense to us, but it makes sense to them. Like whoever wrote, whether it's Nehemiah or Ezra or one of their pupils or something who compiled this information and put it in its final form, that person saw fit to credit Artaxerxes along with Cyrus and Darius for reasons that may or may not, that we may or may not have, but this guy did. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles, celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. On the 14th day of the 1st month, that's the Passover day, that there were exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. Therefore, they could administer the Passover. If they weren't, they wouldn't be able to administer the Passover, but they were, so they could. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the Israel exiles, for their brothers, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all those who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. So there were some people in the land who had been there, apparently, and they were coming into the fold of the Israelites. We talked before about who these people were. Some of them would have been Judahites who survived and were the remnant that lived in the land after the fall. Some of them go back to the days of Assyria. Some of them would have been people that Assyria brought here to settle the land after the fall of Assyria or Babylon. Some of them, by the way, would have been Edomite. We're going to read about the Edomites eventually. It's like the Edomites took over this area to some degree after the fall of Jerusalem. Obadiah and Jeremiah talk about that. That's one of the things they get called out for. So there were a mixture of people living in the land at the time the Jewish exiles came back. Some of them separated themselves from their previous lives and became converts. Some of them may have had genuine ancestral ties to the Jews. Some of them may not have. But it was never supposed to be exclusive only to a certain ethnic people group. And that was one of the things the Jews kind of got confused by as the years went on. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. Whatever the reason, the author here chooses to identify Darius, the king of Persia, as the king of Assyria. Now, it is technically accurate because he was the king of Assyria at that time, in the sense that he inherited what was left of the old Assyrian Empire. The Assyria itself has fallen, okay? They fell to the Babylonians in 612 or so BC. This is now 515 BC, 100 years after that, versus Persia. Babylon eventually fell to Persia. So it is accurate to call the king of Persia the king of Babylon and the king of Assyria. Why the author chose to identify Darius there as the king of Assyria, I don't know. What point he was making, I don't know. He just did. Okay. In his, like I said with Artaxerxes a moment ago, in his mind it made sense. I don't even know who he was, whether he was Ezra or somebody after Ezra. I don't know what he was thinking. That's just, it made sense to him. And we're just going to have to accept that. Okay, so that's it for that. The temple was built. Now we're going to, actually, that's in 515 BC, the temple was built. March 15, 515 BC, according to our calendars, is when we've calculated the building of the finishing, the dedication of the temple. So that is now where we are in the timeline. And the next thing we're going to do is take a detour into Esther, the book of Esther, which takes place in Persia. That's going to be about Jews who are still living in Persia. And that's going to be in the 480s and 470s BC. That's what we're going to do next. Not now, but next time we get together, that's what we're going to be doing.